Hi, I'm Coy Barefoot. One of the most important issues now before Washington is a long overdue reform package that will reinvent criminal justice in America. And despite the bipartisan support, politics is likely to kill it. Criminal justice reform, drugs in America, heroin, gang warfare, and the Kevin Quick case, that's all coming up. Welcome to the program. Tim Heaphy joins me. He is the former district attorney for the Western District of Virginia, and he is now an attorney at Hunton and Williams. Tim, thank you for being here.
Great to see you, Coy. Thank you for having me.
We have a whole lot we want to talk about. Let's start with an issue that is before Congress as we speak. I want to get your insights as a former attorney at the Justice Department about what's going on Capitol Hill with the policy, the proposed policy, the politics, what we should understand about this, why we should care about this. We're talking about proposed changes to criminal justice reform in America.
Right.
Many people on the right and the left say this is long overdue. There is a bipartisan package now before Congress. Explain this to us, Tim.
Sure.
How should we understand this?
Well, we should start with the motivating force behind this, Coy, is that there's just fewer and fewer dollars available to run our criminal justice system. We spend so much money in this country on incarceration. An increasingly large percentage of the federal budget for the Department of Justice goes to the Bureau of Prisons. Just to sustain the large and growing prison population, it costs a lot of money. So in order to reduce that cost and provide money for things like aid to state and local law enforcement, youth recreation and crime prevention programs, and core stuff like FBI agents and prosecutors, we just have to reverse that and start to reduce the Bureau of Prisons budget to leave room for others.
All the other things that DOJ has to pay for.
Exactly.
Right.
And there's also a growing realization that maybe we have been overly broad in our enforcement of drug crime in this country, particularly nonviolent drug offenders. Too many of them, for too long, have gone to prison, and in federal court have gone to prison for really long sentences. So because of that, maybe we've over-incarcerated, and that's a fairness issue, disproportionate impact of those sentences on communities of color. And the cost motivator, a lot of Republicans, as you said, this is a bipartisan issue, are concerned about the amount of money that it's costing. There's a bipartisan groundswell that maybe we need to look hard at criminal sentencing and make some changes.
Yeah, and a lot of people may not know that a lot of this push for these changes, traditionally you would think this is coming from the left. It's actually coming from the right. I mean, there's that whole new group, Right on Crime, which has really been pushing hard for criminal justice reform in America. We lock up too many people. This costs us way too much money just for the government to house, to clothe, to doctor, to provide recreational and work opportunities for an increasing number of people, most of whom are poor and men of color.
Yes. Yeah, it just doesn't work. For many, many years in this country, we have tried to arrest our way to public safety. We thought, as a matter of policy, that if we locked up drug sellers and considered them to be predators or violent or threats to our public safety, that was going to achieve lower levels of crime. That has not worked because we didn't address the underlying driver of drug crime. That's addiction. What we really need to do is take nonviolent drug offenders whose crimes are primarily motivated by addiction and get them to have the system be the intervention to address the underlying driver of the criminal choice, and that is often addiction. That's why drug courts, diversionary programs, or even sentences that don't require long periods of incarceration but condition probation on drug treatment are so much more effective because they fix the underlying problem that led to that person being incarcerated.
I should say I had the honor one time to be the keynote speaker to a drug court graduation of folks who had gone through the program. And I can tell you it was amazing what I learned about these people and their lives. And the takeaway for me was, you know what? Drug court works.
Exactly.
It works.
It does.
And for those who don't know, Tim, what's drug court? And how does it work, and why does it work, you think?
Drug courts are programs where people who are arrested for drug offenses accept responsibility, but before they're sentenced, they're allowed to work on their addiction. They're put into treatment programs, their case is deferred, and if they successfully complete the drug court, then their case is dismissed or they're not incarcerated. So we have to turn this into a public health issue, not just a law enforcement issue. You know, for years and years, we thought, let's just lock a bunch of people up, get them off the street. That's going to send a deterrent message so that people won't sell drugs. Well, that hasn't worked.
It didn't.
Exactly. We have to treat it like a public health issue because it is. We have to address the underlying driver of that, which is addiction. People need to be held accountable. There's no question that there needs to be intervention from the system with respect to drugs, but lengthy mandatory sentences as the consequence, as opposed to steering people who are involved with drug selling into treatment programs, that's much more effective, much more cost efficient, and is going to keep us more safe long term.
And as I understand it, I've done other interviews with folks who've done the research on this kind of stuff. That this isn't an opinion.
No.
We know it for a fact. The research shows you lock a drug offender up for a long time. You don't fix the problem, you make it worse.
Yep.
But you run them through these programs, you can tend to fix the problem.
There's a lot of data, because we've had a pretty long track record with drug courts and other treatment programs, that people that are enrolled in those programs have a much, much lower recidivism rate than people that are simply put in prison.
Right,
and it makes sense, right? When you fix, well, if you have a leaky faucet in your house, you go to the source of where the water might be coming from and you try to prevent the flow of water. It's the same thing. You don't just turn off the faucet or go to a different room for 15 years.
Right.
You fix the underlying problem. That's what we need to do with respect to drugs in this country. The underlying problem is that voracious appetite that we have, and that's what we have to focus on as a health issue.
Yeah. So Tim, this reform package in Washington, let's look at the politics of it.
Yeah.
Is it going to get passed, do you think?
You know, I thought so, but I'm now skeptical, because attached to a lot of these sentencing reform changes that I think are needed is this new thing called mens rea reform. Or
Mens rea. Sounds like Latin, said the Latin scholar.
I never thought I'd be talking about Latin on a television show, but yeah, mens rea means guilty mind, and it is the concept in law that requires a prosecutor to prove that an offender had an intent to do something. And there are a lot of crimes which require specific intent to violate the law. Then there are a lot of other crimes which don't, which could be imposed on a negligence or recklessness.
Involuntary manslaughter.
Involuntary manslaughter is a good example. So there's a group of people in Congress that, attached to the criminal justice sentencing reform bills, would impose a uniform mens rea that would essentially remove ignorance of the law is no defense from every federal crime. Would require prosecutors with every single case, corporate crime to drug crime, to prove the defendant knew that he was violating the law and intended to do so.
So this is controversial because it's, from what I've read about this mens rea proposal in this reform package, that it would essentially be, it's Republicans running cover for big business.
It is a very pro-business proposed change, because a lot of times in big corporate cases we are prosecuting negligence or the failure to train or the failure to obviate a dangerous condition. A lot of our environmental statutes, a lot of our health and safety statutes. Corporations, as you know, are not people. They don't make specific intent decisions. And that is because we don't have to prove specific intent in a lot of corporate cases. That's oftentimes how prosecutors hold corporations accountable. So this is essentially a sort of pro-business agenda that is attaching or grafting onto the sentencing reform legislation and threatens it, because the White House, the administration, strongly opposes this mens rea reform because it would make it very difficult to prosecute.
And they don't have a line item veto on that particular.
It's all being subsumed together.
All at once, which has the intent of the end result is this could kill the entire reform package.
And that's the
because
risk.
Democrats and many Republicans aren't going to support what is this mens rea, which is essentially a big shield for corporate America. It makes it almost impossible to find anybody legally responsible for crimes.
Yes, and you look at who supports the mens rea provision. It's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers have put a lot of money into the criminal justice reform effort, admirably. Their general counsel, is a former prison guard, is out there talking about sentencing reform. That's, in my view, to his credit. But at the same time, they're really pushing this mens rea reform, and we have to make sure that no entity, corporation, or person can be prosecuted unless there's a specific intent to violate the law. That's a corporate protection.
But just to try to put a bow on that particular idea, we know that people violate the law without necessarily sitting back thinking, I'm going to go violate that law.
Particularly true with corporations.
Sure.
No responsible corporate actor is going to, very few are going
right.
to say, we don't care if that's the law, we're going to dump this hazardous material into the creek. That's not the standard. The standard, though, is if they dump hazardous material into the creek because they don't have in place sufficient measures to prevent that, sufficient compliance programs, then they need to be held legally responsible. And with this change, they would not be, because they didn't have the intent to do it.
So let me ask you this. What happens next? I mean, what's the time frame for this process?
Yeah, it's ripe right now. There are a couple of bills passed by the House Judiciary Committee, a couple of bills passed by the Senate Judiciary Committee. They're awaiting floor action, and both Speaker Ryan and Majority Leader McConnell have said that they would bring these bills to the floor. This has been discussed frequently in the context of the presidential campaign. My fear, though, is that there's such opposition on the Democratic side to mens rea reform that is going to prevent support for the overall legislation, and the likely result, unfortunately, is nothing changes.
And if nothing changes, then we're left with a broken criminal justice system.
Well, we do have prosecutorial discretion, and I think that the current Justice Department has exercised appropriately discretion, and it doesn't charge draconian mandatory minimums nearly as frequently as prior administrations. But that's subject to the whims of political change. That's why we need to change the rules that are applied, not just who's applying the rules.
Yeah. Tim, let me change gears here. I want to ask you about, we were talking about drug abuse in America and how we deal with this. I know that in your work previously as the district attorney for the Western District of Virginia, that you dealt quite frequently with issues of drug abuse, drug trafficking, especially in the Valley of Virginia, up and down the I-81 corridor, and the abuse and the trafficking of heroin is making headlines all across the country as the nation really tries to come to grips with what has become a heroin epidemic.
Yes.
What should we understand about this?
Yeah, the pattern that I saw in a lot of communities in Southwest Virginia, in the Valley, really increasingly, Coy, everywhere, even in Charlottesville, is people that start out by using prescription opiate medication, pain medication. They get extra pills because they have a back injury or because they have some kind of surgery. And they get increasingly attracted to or even addicted to the pain medication. But as they use opiate prescription medication, it decreases in terms of its efficacy. Then they start to grind and snort it, so that has a more immediate impact. And eventually, some of those users graduate to heroin. And we've seen a huge spike, as you said, in heroin use and heroin overdoses, particularly in the Valley. And a lot of those users are essentially graduating to that from an origin in prescription drug abuse.
That's awful.
It is.
Oh my gosh. It's just horrific to think about. Somebody who's got no history of drug abuse in their lives goes down that path from something that was prescribed by a doctor.
Yeah, because heroin doesn't have the quality control that prescription drugs has. And there is a lot of really pure, high-grade heroin that is readily available in wholesale quantities in places like Baltimore and Philadelphia. So I remember cases when I was U.S. Attorney where we had people coming to Winchester or coming down farther south in the Valley to Harrisonburg. They went to Baltimore, pulled up in a particular neighborhood, and could buy 30, 40, 50 bags of really high-quality heroin for $150. And then they'd come back home and sell those bags for double, triple the money that they spent to acquire them. And that heroin is such high quality in some cases, sometimes it's mixed with fentanyl, makes it extremely volatile, that it led to a lot of overdoses, a lot of fatal overdoses. So spikes in this overdose problem is reflected in hospital admissions and medical interventions.
And ruined lives and families.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what do we do? What's a nation to do?
Yeah,
you know?
We have to do simultaneously two different things. We have to prosecute people that are bringing the heroin into our community, not those that are street level dealers, but that are importers or that are people that are higher up in the chain. And we have to prevent and educate and treat, right? It is simultaneously hitting this problem from the front end and the back end. Let's try to reduce demand by giving people who are really serious about their addiction treatment resources, by educating young people about the volatility and the danger of using heroin, particularly the kind of heroin that we're seeing more and more now. reduce demand and decrease the supply. The people that are importers, the people that are managers in these very complicated distribution networks need to be charged. So if you approach it from both directions, not simply the law enforcement direction, ignoring the public health, that's really the only way that we're going to tackle it.
And we're not shooting in the dark here. I mean, there's other examples, whether it's in the country or in other countries,
yes,
where this is how they're approaching it, and they're seeing very positive results.
Yes, exactly right. There are lots of examples here and elsewhere. And even in Virginia, there are places where we are bringing this sort of coordinated approach. The task force that prosecutes drug crime in the Winchester area, doing a lot, going to schools and educating people, parents and kids about, before you use heroin, be careful because it's really dangerous. So that double-barreled front and back end approach does work.
So connect some dots for us between that increasing problem that we're seeing and gang involvement, the relationship between gangs, organized criminal gangs, and drug trafficking. We see that here in Virginia. I know the Kevin Quick case is in the next few days, and as this program is airing, will be coming to a close. And look through that window for us and connect those dots.
Yeah, you mentioned the Quick case. I was involved in the decision to bring that case into federal court and actually was personally involved in indicting it, so I can't talk much about the facts of the case. But I can say...
Well, for those who don't know, who is this when we say that?
Kevin Quick was a Waynesboro Reserve police officer who was going to visit his girlfriend and their infant child in the Turtle Creek Apartments right on Hydraulic Road when he was carjacked, abducted, and then forced to provide his ATM PIN. Money was withdrawn from his account, and then his captors discovered that he was a police officer because he had his identification on him and decided they needed to kill him. Shot him in the back of the head and left him in a rural area. And there's been a trial of some people who were involved in that abduction, in addition to another dozen commercial robberies that they did. And it turns out that they are members of a sect of the Bloods gang. And they're right here in our community, with a hierarchy, with supervisors and lieutenants and soldiers.
These aren't wannabe Bloods. This is the real deal. They're connected to the real thing.
Absolutely, and there's lots of literature with their rules of conduct that was, all this evidence was introduced at the trial. So it demonstrates that even in communities, prosperous communities, vibrant communities like ours, there are still people that are drawn to the lure of that gang lifestyle. And I don't think a lot of people fully appreciate that who live in Charlottesville or other communities. A lot of people that feel that they need that protection, that belonging, that sense of identity. It's unfortunately a very destructive form, but it appeals to some folks who I think just feel a little bit lost or disconnected.
Yeah.
And we have to approach that like we've been talking about over the course of this half hour.
I was just thinking, you got to approach the origin of the need for a kid who wants to be in a gang.
For every Kevin Quick case, for every RICO case where we prosecute gang members, we have to do more to provide those people with positive alternatives to gang membership, right? We need to support the Boys and Girls Clubs of our community that are a more positive kind of gang, right? Let's get to the underlying issue.
Another thing that absolutely works.
Absolutely.
We know it for a fact.
Early intervention in kids' lives, whether it's preschool, whether it's mentors, whether it's recreational, educational, that works. Paying attention to our young people makes them so much less likely to get involved in joining a gang because they're getting a sense of self-esteem and belonging without having to make that criminal
Without
choice.
having to walk down to the street corner and try to find
or rob a store
to
prove themselves.
Yeah. So what gives you hope, Tim? As a district attorney who was on the front lines, you're now at Hunt and Williams, but what gives you hope that we're going to see some changes? If this reform package doesn't work and politics kills it, gangs at work, this heroin problem, what gives you hope, as somebody who's on the front lines dealing with these issues all the time, that we're going to see some positive changes?
Yeah.
That we're not going to be here 10 years from now saying, yeah, we're still dealing with this stuff.
Well, I do think we're going to be here 10 years from now dealing with an unfortunately persistent criminal justice challenge. It may be different slightly. There may be something that has emerged that we can't anticipate now. But I do think, Coy, that overall, I'd like to think that what did Dr. King say? That the arc of history bends towards justice. That there's a sort of a product of experience that we have as a matter of policy and of decision making, right? We have tried some things historically that haven't worked. And maybe I'd like to think, maybe I'm naive enough to think that we actually incorporate those lessons and we do things a little bit differently. We cannot just have this old-fashioned law and order, lock everybody up who commits any kind of crime approach and think that we're going to be safe.
And it doesn't mean you don't believe in law and order.
Oh,
It just
absolutely.
means, you know, the way that you think you're achieving it isn't working.
It's a question of using a net versus using a spear, right? My ideal approach to law and order is like spear fishing, right? You go into communities, and when there are predator fish who are swimming, you try to identify them and target them. We cannot drop a net over that in community and say everybody who's doing anything wrong is going to be caught up in that net and we're going to sweep them away. That creates distrust among communities in law enforcement, and that ultimately makes them less likely to provide information, and it's harder for police to sift the predators from the minnows. So we have learned, I think, that we have to do a better job of connecting law enforcement to the communities that they serve. There has to be an increased level of confidence if we're going to be truly effective at targeting.
And at the end of the day, as a people, not only be open to change, but be open to trying new things that we know work.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's some political risk with that. I hope that there are courageous people in Washington and in Richmond that are willing to reduce criminal penalties. And the risk is that when that happens, somebody could go out having been released early from federal prison because of a reduced sentence and commit another crime. That's likely to happen. But that doesn't mean that it's bad policy, right? There's the risk-averse approach with respect to crime has always been, don't change penalties. If anything, just ratchet them up. That's safer politically. We need some courage to realize that that's wrong-headed, even if there's some risk.
Yeah. Tim, thank you for the work you do, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Coy.
Tim Heaphy, he's the former district attorney for the Western District of Virginia. He's now at Hunton and Williams. We'll take a very quick break, and when we get back, I got a treat for you. Stay with me. Welcome back. So now I got a little treat for you. I would like you to sit back, relax, and enjoy a mini documentary, A Barefoot Excursions, from the archive. Here's a look at the founding of the city of Charlottesville. Hi, I'm Coy Barefoot, and today we are in beautiful downtown Charlottesville on the downtown mall. Let me tell you where Charlottesville came from. You'll remember that in April of 1607, the English settlers landed at Jamestown and created the first permanent English settlement in the New World. But it took them more than 100 years to get up to what's now Richmond. And as they steadily moved further west, they created new counties. So Goochland County was created in 1728. Albemarle County was created in 1744 and originally included most of what is now Central Virginia along the Blue Ridge. The county seat for Albemarle County was originally Scott's Landing, where the Scott family ran a ferry back and forth across the James River, what we call Scottsville. But as more and more people moved into Albemarle, they decided to decrease its size and move the courthouse to a more central location. They picked a site on the hill above the Rivanna River, named for Queen Anne. And they basically laid out lots, 50 one-acre lots, on either side of the county highway, the old colonial highway from Richmond to the valley, the three-notched road. So named because settlers put 3 notches in the trees so they wouldn't get lost and they would mark their path. So this new town that was created in 1762 was created on either side of the Three-Notch Road and named for Queen Charlotte Sophia, King George III's young German bride. Sophia was not George's choice. It was something of an arranged royal marriage. She was the grandmother of Queen Victoria and the great-great-great-great-grandmother of the current Queen Elizabeth II. Queen Charlotte was a patroness of the arts, known to Johann Christian Bach and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, among others. She was also an amateur botanist who helped to establish Kew Gardens. Queen Charlotte and King George III had 15 children. So the new county seat of Albemarle County was named for Queen Charlotte, and this would thereafter be known as Charlottetown or Charlottesville. So I hope you enjoyed that. There's plenty more in the archive, and we'll take a look at some more next time. I'm Coy Barefoot. I hope you have a terrific week, and y'all be good to each other.